Welcome to the Send Talk podcast, your easy to understand guide to some of the most common queries we get asked when it comes to special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND. I'm your host, Vic Elizabeth Turnbull, and together with SENDIASS Manchester, the city's information, advice and support service for SEND, we'll empower you to make informed decisions for you or your child. You'll hear from the SENDIASS Manchester team, and they'll join me online for a chat. Hello, this episode is part of our FAQ, or Frequently Asked Questions series of the Send Talk podcast. In these episodes, we get straight to the point to answer the most common and very specific queries we get asked here at SENDIASS Manchester. And joining me for these episodes is Laura Nardella, an advisor at SENDIASS Manchester.
Thank you, Vic. Hi, I'm Laura, and just to let you know, for more information about everything we talk about in this episode, simply head to our website, sendiassmanchester.org.
Thanks, Laura. So, what's the big question for this episode?
So, Vic, today's question is one that we hear quite often on the helpline, and it comes in various guises. So it can be summarised as something like this. So, school is asking me to pick up my child, and this could be for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they've said, they need to cool off after an incident, or perhaps they're upset or not engaging. There's some kind of disruptive behaviour that's happening, and they're saying, you need to come and get your child because of this. And schools say you have to collect your child even though school is open. So this episode is to shed a bit more light on the question in these situations. School's open, you've been asked as a parent to collect your child's been told to go home early. Is this allowed to happen?
Is it allowed to happen?
Well, I'm going to counter that with a question, Vic, because that's what we would be asking the parents on the helpline. The question is, has the school logged this as an official suspension, or what used to be called a fixed term exclusion? If so, then yes, it is allowed to happen. However, on the other side, if this hasn't been logged as an official suspension, then no, it isn't lawful and is classed as an illegal exclusion or suspension.
So in this situation, just simply sending a child home, doesn't that automatically count as a suspension because they're being suspended by the school?
Well, no, it doesn't. I mean, the end result seems to be the same for the parent, but it's not classed as a suspension at that stage. So there's formal regulations and guidance and procedures around suspensions, and these need to be followed. So schools do have the right, obviously, to send pupil home if there is a breach of the behaviour policy. And obviously, they will do that through the suspension process. However, this needs to be recorded formally and they have to follow their regulations. So in order to recap, it isn't the same. Just because the pupil's at home doesn't mean that automatically the suspension process has been followed.
Does that count even if it's just for a few hours that they've been sent home for?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter how long. And so you might think, we don't have to follow this. It's just for a couple of hours or for an afternoon. And it also doesn't matter, if there is an agreement from the parent carer about that. Any exclusion from school, even if it's for the briefest period, should be officially recorded.
So what I'm getting from this, Laura, that any sending of home must be officially recorded and go through the school's processes. But how are parents going to know that this is being done formally?
That's a really good question, because that actually does come up on the helpline quite a lot. If you're not sure, if you're saying, is it official? Is it lawful suspension? Is it unlawful suspension? If you don't know whether it's been done correctly, how are you going to make that decision? How are you going to understand that? And we've had both sides of the situation on the helpline. We've had parents ring up thinking the suspension was official. Then when we've done a bit of digging, we found out that actually it hadn't been recorded as suspension at all. And we've also had situations the other way around. So yeah, it is actually really important to know the difference.
All right, Laura. So there are formal regulations and guidance and procedures around exclusions and suspensions. And these need to be followed. I think I'm understanding correctly. So how do parents know if a school have followed the suspension process?
That's a good question, because any parents listening need to know, okay, I need to be absolutely sure that this is happening. And sometimes it's not as straightforward as you would think. Let's briefly go through what happens during an official suspension, and hopefully that will make it clear for parents listening. The first point is that there usually will be some kind of incident at the school, and the schools must notify the parent verbally as soon as possible. So usually that'll be the head teacher or school staff, and usually a head, that will call you and ask you to pick your child up, and they would be informing you that your child's been suspended. The confusion is that this first step will be the same for both of the situations that we're discussing, official and unofficial as well. The next point is that once you've taken your child home, within the next 24 hours, but hopefully less than that, you'll receive a written follow-up. So this can be an email or it can be a letter, depending on what your school does, but it will be in writing and it will confirm some very key points about the suspension. First of all, it will confirm that there is a suspension. So you will have that in writing as a parent. And they will also explain the reason for this decision. So what happened that led to the suspension decision being made. So you will have a clear understanding of why it happened. And it will also state how long the suspension is for. So it will state, okay, this child is being suspended for 3 days. And you will also be notified of the date when your child is back. So there will be real clarity of when your child is due to start back at school. And if the suspension is the longer suspension, you may be notified of a reintegration meeting. So that's a meeting that you might have maybe on the very start of the first day that they're back, or maybe the day before that they're back. And that's like a meeting with the staff and the pupil to reintegrate into the school. Now, if it's a very short suspension, maybe a day or two, you may not have a reintegration meeting. If it's longer, you would have one. But again, that would depend on the school. You would have the clarity of what's going on, and that will be written in a letter for you. So if you're not getting any of that, if you've had the phone call, and even in the phone call, if they say your child's been suspended, you need to pick them up and they can't come to school for the rest of the week, let's say, for example, and you've not received anything else in writing, then it's more than likely it's not an official suspension. So it would be an illegal or unlawful suspension.
Some very clear points then to recognise if your child getting sent home is an official suspension or not. Now, Laura, does it really matter if your child is suspended or not, if they have to be off school anyway? I mean, isn't it better just to be sent home? Because if they're suspended, aren't suspensions on the child's record?
That does come up as a question. So parents might be thinking, well, I don't want my child to be suspended. It's going to stay on their record. How's that going to affect them? What's the point of it? So I'm just going to go back to an earlier point. Even if you as a parent carry an agreement, if the school have asked the child to leave without going through the exclusion process, this isn't lawful. But then the question that you were saying, Vic, is, does it matter? Why would you want it to be officially done? The main thing with unofficial suspensions or exclusions, there is no guidance to it and there's no monitoring. So, for example, if your child is getting into trouble, there's regular issues, and the school is unable to keep your child in school, or they're sending them home a lot, then clearly there's an issue to be addressed. But if this isn't being recorded, it's really difficult to challenge, and it's very difficult to bring the issue up. And also, you lose out on the protections of the guidelines and procedures that are built into the suspension process.
Ah, right. So what are the protections then?
Well, I think the main thing is around the real clarity about what is happening. If it's the right course of action, how long is it going to be for? The whole thing that is being recognised that this is actually happening. Now, it may not be clear straight away as to why that's important. So I'll just go into some of the points, and I could even give some examples with unofficial exclusions, how that point hasn't taken place and how that's affected it. So the first thing is the clarity about length of time. With an official suspension, you know exactly how long your child's going to be off. You know when your child is going back into school. You can also prepare for that, and it's really, really clear. With an unofficial suspension, The parent might be told they can't come back from a week. We've had situations where then this has been changed a period of time. They've been told something different. It's been extended. There's a lack of clarity for the pupil and for the parent. And it's not really clear who's making this decision. So with an official suspension, it's actually against guidelines. You cannot extend the time. You can't say you're off for 3 days and then say, you know what, we're going to add an extra 3 days onto that. You're not allowed to do that. So you can see straight away, Vic, that there's a protection there. The next section is around clear regulations around monitoring how they're used. There is very specific guidance around suspensions. I think I've probably made that clear about 100 times here. But some of the things that it goes into is on what is deemed reasonable or proportionate by the school. So you can already sense there's protection there. So pupils can't be suspended just for any reason. So for example, if your child was told to go home because they're upset and refusing to go into class, as an unofficial suspension, you might be called and said, right, you have to pick up your child. However, as this isn't a breach of behavioural policy, then technically they couldn't be suspended because of this. So although it's a hypothetical example, it just shows that without the guidelines around suspensions, you might be in a bit more of a vulnerable position because it's really difficult to sort of challenge the school around whether or not they should have asked your child to go home or not.
And what's more relevant to our parents listening to this episode, there are additional considerations the school must be making for their pupils with SEND before exclusions or suspensions are even considered.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Vic. So we can see here that if following guidance, if you've got a child or pupil with special educational needs and disabilities, there are other considerations to be taken into account. So that's even more protections. And the flip side of that is if it's not an official suspension, so if you're looking at an unofficial suspension where your child with special educational needs and disabilities is being asked to go home for a particular reason, then you may not have those kind of protections or considerations being taken into account.
So it sounds like there are lots of protections when you and the school go through the official suspensions process.
Yeah, and there's even more. So, for example, if your child is suspended for over 5 days, then on the 6th day, the school must arrange for suitable full-time education or some kind of education going on from the 6th day of suspension. With unlawful suspensions, this isn't recorded and you don't have this right. And there are also, in certain circumstances, you've got the right to appeal to the school governors for reconsideration of suspensions. For example, if your child has experienced a certain number of suspensions within a term, you would then have the right to go before the school governors to address this. Again, with unofficial suspensions, they wouldn't be recorded and you wouldn't have this right to sort of challenge and address this.
Wow, there seems to be so much to take in about suspensions.
There really is. We have a fact sheet all about exclusions, suspensions, unofficial exclusions, and part-time timetables, which is a good starting point. It's our fact sheet number 9, and we'll put a link in the show notes, and that'll take you straight to our website where it sits, and it can be downloaded from there. There is also the Department for Education School Suspension and Permanent Exclusion Guidance, which has recently been updated, and the schools need to follow that. So really handy resource to have a little read through, and we'll put a link in the show notes for any parents listening to want to have a look at that as well.
I forgot a really key question, Laura. What if parents are okay that their child comes home?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Vic. And it does happen a lot. And you kind of understand why it does, because let's say you've got a child with special educational needs and disabilities. They're at school's telling you that they're upset and you have to come and collect them. Obviously, as a parent, you're thinking, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want them to come home. I want to make sure they're okay. And obviously, that's absolutely fine. You know, That's completely understandable. But I think what we're saying to parents is that it's still important to raise what has happened. So in this situation, I would say the next step would be to contact the SENCO, which is the Special Educational Needs Coordinator at the school, and address the issue. Talk about what's happened and why they've sort of been asked to be sent home. And I would definitely say to do this, especially if it is happening regularly. Because as I said before, sending a child home should not be a strategy. And if it's taking place, especially for children with special educational needs and disabilities, it could be a sign of unmet needs. If your child is on SEN support, then I would suggest that you can also listen to our podcast episode 1 on how to access SEN support in schools. And if your child has an EHC plan and there seems to be a lot of issues around perhaps being sent home or difficulties which might be resulting in issues which then you're being called to take your child home, I would say then the next step would be to call a review, an annual review of the plan. So you need to review the existing plan because clearly it would seem that perhaps something isn't working and that needs to be reviewed. We also have an episode of our podcast series on annual reviews of EHC plans.
So it's takeaway time for parents listening to this episode who are in or who have been in this situation. What's your takeaway for them, Laura?
So if your child's school has rung you, is asking you to collect your child for a behavioural issue, ask them, is my child being suspended? So you'll have some clarity on the situation. Hopefully you've heard everything today. You've taken it all on board. And so you'll know all the questions to ask. And you'll also know that if they're not being suspended and the school are asking you to take them home, then this is not lawful and the child should be in school. You can also perhaps ask the school how they are recording this time away from school. That would also give you a bit of a steer of what's happening. And obviously, if there is a suspension taking place, then because you know all about the procedures, you'll be aware if the school is following those or not. I would always suggest that you go back and read the fact sheet because I know there's a lot to take on. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're not clear, and it can often happen, it just doesn't feel straightforward and you're not really quite sure and you need some more advice and guidance on that, don't hesitate. You can always call the SENDIASS Manchester helpline and our number is in the show notes, and you can just talk about your particular circumstance in your case with us and we'll be able to give you a steer on that.
And of course, if you're listening outside of Manchester, all local authorities provide a SENDIASS service. Just nip onto Google and search for your local service.
Thanks, Vic.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Laura. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening.
Do you have a question for us that you'd like us to answer on a future edition of the Frequently Asked Questions Send Talk podcast? If you do, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. Please send your question along with your name to our email, which is sendiass@manchester.gov.uk. And the email address is included in the show notes as well.
It certainly is. Thanks, Laura.